educate myself in order to be a part of this conversation. So
Right.
But I didn't even think through systemic racism. Can you give us a little breakdown on systemic racism, and then we can kind of dive into that?
Yeah, so I think, and I can speak to, this is a U.S. experience,
Yeah.
right? But you think about the way wealth is typically generated through ownership of the land or ownership of a home, um, assets, or through capital markets, right? Which Blacks have not had access to. As an example, if you look at the woman, the girl who was the first Black child to go into an integrated school after civil rights, she just turned 65, like this year. Right, so it's not something from Mesopotamia, right? It was yesterday that this happened. And actually, I think an interesting example is because sometimes when you look at Black people who are successful and you feel like, oh, well, this is great. I think interesting examples when I was working with Puff, and we looked into buying an NFL team, and it became a popular thing because what was happening with the NFL. We felt like the NFL was not treating their players and Black people at large appropriately with the level of respect that was needed. So it would be great to have Black ownership. But when we really dug all the way into it, you realize that honestly, no different than like the Voting Rights Act, where if your grandfather hadn't voted, you couldn't vote, which made no sense because your grandfather was a slave. In trying to buy an NFL team, the amount of liquidity that you would have to part with, a Black person who's worth $1 billion today, which is less than 10 in the United States, they are making their money right now. They can't just part with like, oh, yeah, sure, I can part with $800 million and just put it aside. They absolutely can't. So even for the people who have made it, things like getting an NFL team are almost impossible to them because they can't go into the historical family wealth, or they can't sell the land that the 100 acres that they inherited, or the 1 acre or the half acre. And it's quite deeply rooted in banking, including mortgages, in schools, in terms of history, in terms of community policing, in terms of jobs. I'll give you another quick example. Studies show that if you have an ethnic sounding name on your resume, you are 50% less likely to get called for a job. It's not a coincidence that the Black unemployment rate is almost always twice as high as the general market. That's literally just the freakiest correlation in math I've ever seen, or it's an obvious cause and effect. When you look at redlining as another example, where when communities were in the 19, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's like 70, 80 years ago, when bankers sit down and draw lines around, well, this community is all Black, so we put a red line around. It could have been a middle class, thriving, amazing community. If it was all Black or all minority at that time, all Jewish, it received a red line. And that red line still impacts. If you lay over maps from that time to now, you will see how those same communities who were ineligible for loans or had to pay at exorbitant criminal rates, if they were able to even get a loan, were disenfranchised as a result of that, because you can't build wealth if you only rent. You can't build wealth if you don't have a loan to be able to get land, to build your own farm, to be able to have something to own, to pass down. So if you are always sharecropping and renting, you do not build anything for the next generation, which is where we stand today. Things like lexicon are incredibly important. As a person who builds brands, we spend a lot of time thinking through exactly what color are you going to use for your package? What words are you going to use? How does something become sticky or viral on social? If Black people were a brand, we have had terrible branding, right? I mean, in terms of the history of this country, right? So if you go in the dictionary, everything bad is associated with the word Black. That wears on somebody by the time they're 3 or 4 years old at the most. We talked, Lisa, about the brown eyes, blue eyes study, which I feel needs to be mandatory content. By the time you're 7 years old, you need to see that. And if you're not familiar with this, please Google it and watch it. But it shows how this teacher deals with the classroom, all white, in a town that was all white, all Christian at the time, in the middle of the last civil rights era in the 60s. And she conducted an experiment over, I think, 2 or 3 days, very short, maybe just 2 days, with her brown-eyed students and her blue-eyed students. And essentially, as an example, she went to all the blue-eyed students and said that brown-eyed are superior. You blue eyes are lazy. It's nothing you can do to stop it. It's genetic. And she gave them less time on the playground, and she reinforced things and said, oh, you don't have your glasses today. Well, wouldn't expect much from a blue eye, and those type of things over one day. Within just 2 days, These kids who were previously doing well on tests started doing poorly. These kids started getting into a fight. And what was before just a description, like I'm blue-eyed, all of a sudden became like a curse word. In fact, one of the kids compared it to being called a nigger in 2 days. If you can imagine that level of systemic abuse, of lexicon manipulation, of media mismanagement and misinformation over and over and over again for centuries at every turn, you start to see how, A, you're doing a disservice to both sides because A, you have a white person who actually starts to really believe, well, I am actually superior. On this experiment, one of the kids said, I loved being superior. He said, I felt like a king. He was like 6 years old, right? That's how, and you can also understand how if you feel like a king and somebody comes to you and says, oh, we should be treated equally, it feels almost as if you're being attacked, like your kingdom is under attack, which is a way when I think about if I'm a white person who's never been exposed and all of a sudden you're asked for equal rights, it does not feel like equal rights. It feels like you were trying to strip me of my superiority. You're trying to strip me of my natural goodness and I'm just naturally better than you, which is just not true. And everybody has to deal, I think, head on, face in the mirror of understanding each of our roles and saying like, well, God, as Black people who have been hearing this over and over again, has anybody started to believe it? Is there a matter of insecurity as a Black community of saying, well, like, damn, I mean, why is every word terrible? Why are we being over-policed? Instead of looking at the systems that have been in place, which really just comes down to the economics, to continue a system where you have a very small group of wealthy people at the top, and you give poor white people, a false target of saying, oh, it's these minorities. There's a running joke in the Black community, and maybe it's not just a Black community, but I've always known. They said that the thing a poor white man can always hold on to is that he is better than a Black person. He may not be rich, but he's better than a Black man.
So you said so many powerful things, and there's one thing that really freaking sticks out that if you're okay, I'd like to kind of go down it a bit more. So you were saying about how, just in 2 days, these kids are basically taught and can either feel inferior or feel superior, depending on what they are told. And the reason why I think that's so powerful comes to remind me of the study that they did with these little young Asian girls, where they took a bunch of young Asian women and they basically put them to have a test, a maths test. And before they went in to do the test, they told these young girls, they reminded them, hey, remember, you're a woman. So they go in, they take the test. Then they get a different group of Asian girls. Before they go in to take the test, they went in and said, remember, you're Asian. And the results, the data was so freaking astonishing that the group that were told they were Asian scored so much higher than the group that were told they were women. Now,
exactly.
They were the same class. Their intelligence was all roughly the same. So just in what you are told and the belief you have about yourself has a consequence and a result. Going back to what you're saying, if depending on where you're born, what your skin color is, what you've been taught, will then in effect have an effect on the results of your life. So I think education is such a powerful tool. And again, I'm just grasping the straws here. I don't actually know the answer, but it seems based on our discussion and based on these studies that if we're able to educate the younger generation, the kids, into understanding and not having this racial divide, the hope is that makes a dent somewhat.
Well, this is a major portion of it for sure, is that we are not, the history books and what you are taught in schools, in American schools, it's frankly close to just pure propaganda to a certain degree. Any success of Black and brown people are largely eliminated. I just found out that the richest man in the history of the world, Mansa Musa, was a Black man last year. I'm 44. Right. So there are certain things that you don't learn. You don't learn there are different periods in history and different conquerors. You don't learn about the Black generals, the Black leaders. You don't learn anything about the continent of Africa. You don't learn about the slave revolutions and what they were done. You also don't learn about the depth of the depth and the strategy of slavery. And what does it do when somebody can be burned and killed for learning how to read two sentences, and how families are ripped apart, and how one of the best jobs you could get was to be studded out, because at least you didn't have to be getting beat on the field, right? And in terms of like seeing mothers, yes, of course they would like to leave, but you've taken their kids away from them, and how food was manipulated, et cetera, and just the mental abuse and anguish and the intensity, the level of really just evil doing, the strategy, the consistency, just how horrific, how truly horrific slavery was and what it did to the Black community is very much glossed over and not properly taught. And conversely, I think the greatness, the intelligence, the innovation, the brilliance, the fighting back, the inventions, things that came out of the Black American community, and it has never been told. What has been also eliminated is the history of the great things that happened in the continent of Africa. That just isn't taught at all in U.S. history, and that's a bigger issue in general, because the United States, I think, does a terrible job about teaching from a global point of view. Right? You have maybe a semester of global history, whereas other countries actually deeply teach where we stand in the world, what other languages are like. We're at a point now, unfortunately, it's gotten worse in the last 20 years, where people are literally actively attacking people who speak other languages as if that's something to be embarrassed about.
Yeah, hearing what you're saying about all these incredible Black people that are not taught in schools, it immediately reminded me of the guy that ran the 4-minute mile. Right, where it's like people kept saying it can't be done, it can't be done, it can't be done. So people weren't trying because they didn't believe it was possible. The second the guy ended up running the mile in 4 minutes, I think since then that record has been broken 1,300 times. Why? Because the second people saw it was possible, gave them the belief. Once they believed it was possible, they would act in accordance. And so as you were talking about the educational part of it, it made me think about, okay, I understand why actually that is extremely important. Because like you were saying, right, you're 44 and you just found out that one of the wealthiest people of all time was Black. It's like if we're not told that as children, all races, then it doesn't allow us to think of Black people as being able to achieve that, which then instills a certain mindset. But I think in emphasizing that, in teaching that, it allows, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Black community to feel like anything is possible, and teaching that to the children so that they can then act in accordance to strive for greatness.
Yeah, I mean, we often say, like, you can't be what you don't see. And you have two things here happening, right? One is there are no examples being taught in mainstream institutions or school and or on the media about